The Empire had never seen anything like it. Rain. Rain for endless days, weeks, even months. And it seemed that everyone was powerless to stop it. The peasants could only look on despairingly as their fields were flooded and their crops drowned. All the Empire suffered, but the western provinces were hit hard especially. And soon enough, hunger began to stalk the Empire. Clans great and small began reaching into their food stores from the previous year's harvest in order to stave off mass starvation. As ever, though, the imperial court, secure in its little bubble of tithe-fueled plenty, remained indifferent. Appeals were sent to the court to lower imperial taxes for that year, allowing the clans to hold back some of their own food to feed their peasants. But this was rejected by Emerald champion Okodo Kinburo on behalf of his master, Hantei XX. And so hunger continued, especially in the mountainous lands of the Dragon Clan, which had always been low on food and farmland to begin with. Winter brought no reprieve, as the heavy rains were replaced by heavy snow. So heavy, in fact, that many imperial roads were rendered unusable, and the Winter Court of 660, intended to be held at Kyuden-Bayushi, was cancelled for that year, the first time that this had ever happened. Time passed. The year 661 began, and with the coming of spring, the snow melted, and once again the peasants looked on as their fields were flooded. Now it was no longer enough to simply tighten one's sash and carry on. Now, widespread hunger morphed into famine. That famine now touched even the relatively prosperous domains of the Lion, Scorpion, and Crane clans. Rice, long the staple of the empire, now became more precious than gold, and a vicious trade war erupted between merchants of the Daidoji and Yasuki families for control of and access to rice, as each fought economically in order to benefit and feed their respective clans. At this point, even direct intervention by the imperial government would not have alleviated the situation. Like a great drumskin taut with tension, the people of Rokugan suffered through that year, praying to the fortunes for relief. Alas, the fortunes remained indifferent, and as the year 661 transitioned into the year 662, the famine that still haunted the empire was joined by disease. Water fever, it was called, because not only did it kill you if you consumed tainted water, you could be infected by swimming or bathing in tainted water. First, the afflicted came down with high fevers. Then, usually after 3 days, severe abdominal pain and diarrhea occurred. If untreated within 5 days, death was the result. Water fever was widespread, and so, caught between the vices of hunger and disease, people resorted to desperate measures. At some point in 662, word reached Lion champion Okodo Masahisa that his northern border was being swamped with refugees from the Dragon Clan. Hordes of peasants and low-ranking Ji samurai were crossing the border into the more relatively prosperous lands of the Lion. But the Great Famine stalked the Lion lands as well, and Masahisa didn't have enough to provide for his own people, let alone these refugees. And so, to Dragon champion Togashi Toshimasa, he sent an embassy led by his son and heir, Okodo Masaumi. Masaumi did get his audience, but Toshimasa remained completely uncommunicative. Indeed, the clan champion did not even acknowledge Masaumi's presence. Toshimasa had been in a state of constant meditation since the Great Famine had begun. But to Masaumi, Toshimasa's lack of response could only be viewed as an insult. When word got back to the Lion clan, tempers flared and war was declared. Of course, like most wars in Rokugani history during the Hantei dynasty, the Dragon-Lion War proved a short one. Indeed, there is only one battle mentioned. The border of the Lion and Dragon clans is marked by Oboreshinu Boikisho Kawa, the drowned merchant river. And it was here that a Lion army, commanded by Masaumi, met the army of the Dragon clan, commanded by daimyo Mirumoto Umeka. Umeka was not exactly thrilled with this. Not only had her lord Toshimasa failed to even negotiate with the Lion clan, he had seemingly refused to take any action when Masaumi had raised his army and begun marching north, sending only a cryptic letter to Umeka. It was the Mirumoto daimyo herself who had had to take charge of the clan and organize for its defense. Either way, both sides met at the Battle of the Drowned Merchant River. Of course, the only detail that is given about this battle is that it was ultimately indecisive. What was decisive was the subsequent intervention of the Phoenix Clan. At the command of Shiba Moriaki, Phoenix Clan champion and Umeka's secret lover, contingents of the Shiba House Guard were sent to support the Dragon Clan. The realization that they might have to fight a war with two great clans while suffering from a famine caused cooler heads to prevail in the Lion Clan leadership, and so, by the end of the year, a peace was negotiated. The Lion did get some satisfaction out of this, insofar as Umeka had to publicly apologize for the Dragon Clan's failure to handle the refugee crisis, but Moriaki was able to smooth things over by allowing Dragon Clan refugees to come live in the Phoenix Lands, which suggested that his clan was doing better during the famine than the others were, a fact that would be confirmed by subsequent events. But helping refugees didn't exactly alleviate the famine, and along with the Crab Clan, the Dragon was the most urgent in sending pleas for reduction of taxes to the imperial capital. Hantei XX responded to these appeals by interpreting them as insultingly impertinent, and responded by levying punitive higher taxes on both the dragon and the crab. Desperate to alleviate the suffering of her clan and her people, acting crab champion Hida Tsuneko did something that very few high-ranking crab samurai have ever done. She decided to present herself at the Winter Court of 662, which happened to be held that year at Kyuden Doji. Alas, her effort to appeal directly to the emperor for relief were not only ignored, but she was openly mocked in court by Crane Clan champion Doji Morito. Naturally, the Crane, always the richest and most prosperous of the 7 great clans, was weathering the famine better than most. And so Tsuneko departed the Winter Court, utterly humiliated. But the woman the Crab Clan would remember ever after as Mother Wolf was not about to take that insult lying down, and she began making preparations the moment she returned to Crab Lands. If she could not have relief for her clan, she would at least have the satisfaction of wiping that smug smile clean off Doji Morito's face, preferably with a sword. The year 663 began, and at last the heavy precipitation that had caused the Great Famine came to an end. But the return of normal weather was cold comfort for the people of Rokugan. By now, any food reserves that had been there before the famine were exhausted. The best healers of the Asahina family were busy working themselves to the bone trying to contain outbreaks of water fever. And once again, war joined forces with pestilence and famine to bedevil the Emerald Empire. Yes, indeed, the Dragon-Lion War was not an isolated incident. Now food was so scarce that low-ranking samurai were defecting from their clans and becoming ronin en masse. Now, in addition to famine and water fever, the peasants had to live in fear of roving gangs of bandits, mostly comprised of men and women who were just as desperate and starving as they were, but were often better armed. Riots began flaring up all across the empire, and it looked as if Rokugan was about to tear itself to pieces. Meanwhile, the trade war between the Yasuki and Daidoji families had just turned murderous. No longer content with employing economic pressures or even sabotage, the daimyo of the two families, Yasuki Miwako and Daidoji Katsunan, now sanctioned assassination of the other side's merchants in order to literally shut them out of the market. Of course, this vicious economic war only served to do even more damage to the situation, and the price of rice continued to skyrocket. And then something happened that caught the Crane Clan completely off guard. Crab champion Hida Tsuneko declared war. Like a tidal wave from the south, the Crab army swept through the southern provinces of the Crane with a desperate fury. It seemed that Tsuneko had brought with her every Crab warrior that could be spared from watching the Carpenter's Wall. Every bushi that was still strong enough to carry weapons and armor. Taken by surprise and up against a numerous and highly motivated enemy, the crane stood no chance. Like a swarm of murderous locusts, the crab army swept through the lands of the Asahina and the southern provinces of the Daidoji. Every province from Shinkyo to Sabishi was taken and pillaged for every last grain of rice. The only notable resistance came when the crab attacked the coastal village of Jukamimura, where they were met by a crane army led by the daimyo Daidoji Katsunan. He attempted to challenge the Crab Clan champion to a duel, only for Tsuneko to cut him down mid-sentence. The sight of his death so demoralized the Crane soldiers that the battle quickly turned into a rout, with many of the panicking Crane samurai being driven off the low cliffs nearby Jukamimura. The Crane would remember this shameful event as the Battle of Honor's Flight. The crab, remembering the sight of white hair and turquoise robes fluttering on that final fatal plunge, would refer to the battle, with characteristically grim humor, as the Battle of Flying Cranes. While all this was going on, those aforementioned bandit gangs of former samurai were now emboldened or desperate enough to attack major population centers. Both Ryoko Owari Toshi in Scorpion Lands and Toshi no Omoidoso in Phoenix Lands were taken over, and the starving bandits feasted upon both cities' heavy stores of food. By now, the famine was affecting even the higher ranks of the empire, meaning the military capacity of the great clans was now too weak to deal even with a bunch of raggedy bandits. Even the greatest samurai cannot fight well on an empty stomach. The Scorpion clan only managed to retake Ryoko Owari with help from Mantis clan mercenaries, while a Phoenix army led by clan champion Shiba Moriaki failed miserably to retake Toshi no Omoidoso, all because Moriaki's men and women were simply too weak with hunger and illness to fight effectively. The bandits were only expelled by the intervention of the imperial legions led by Akodo Kenburo. When Hantei XX learned of Moriaki's failure, he was so offended by the idea of a great clan losing to bandits that he sent an order for the clan champion to commit seppuku, which he duly performed. He was succeeded by Shiba Naho, the daughter of an unimportant magistrate, and so young that she'd only just undergone her Genpuku coming-of-age ceremony. However, the greatest crisis of the Great Famine was brewing just to the west in the lands of the Dragon Clan. Her name was Asahime, the only daughter of a fairly successful merchant. Because her mother died of a fever when she was very young, Asahime had grown up spoiled by her rich father. But though she could have anything she wanted, within reason, it seemed that Asahime's truly great fascination was the arts of war. She was an avid reader of military treatises, including the Book of Sun Tao, written by a legendary ronin of the same name, and Leadership, the work written by Akodo One-Eye himself. When the Great Famine had begun 2 years ago, Asahime's father had sought to alleviate the suffering of the people by buying up as much food as he could so that he could distribute it to the poor. Unfortunately, he then fell afoul of a lion magistrate who killed him for refusing to hand over his stock of rice. This kindled a flame of vengeance in Asahime's heart, and she had spent the next 2 years drawing to her men and women who were just as desperate and just as angry as she was. By the year 664, her followers were a secret army scattered all across the northern provinces of the Emerald Empire, just waiting for their leader's command to strike. Alas, the relative reprieve from nature that the empire had enjoyed in 663 came to an end in the beginning of 664 with a new outbreak of water fever. Meanwhile, Doji Morito, seeing that the Crab Clan controlled over a third of his territory, went to his brother-in-law, the Emperor, for help, and Hantei XX obliged, sending the imperial legions led by Akodo Kenburo in support. When Hida Tsuneko saw the two armies heading her way, she faced a difficult choice. Having feasted on the comparative abundance of the southern Crane lands, the crab soldiers were much better fed than they had been at the start of the Rice War. But they were still tired, still relatively weak, and now they were outnumbered. And even if Tsuneko didn't rate the Crane army all that highly, there was the matter of the Imperial legions and the man who commanded them. Kenburo had a well-earned and fearsome reputation. If his side won the day, the Emerald Champion would be especially harsh with the defeated enemy. And so, Tsuneko commanded that the Crab army make an orderly retreat back to their homelands, taking with them all the food that they hadn't yet consumed. And so, the Rice War ended about as inconclusively as the Dragon-Lion War had the previous year. The Crane clan would gain a small measure of vengeance the following year when, through adroit politicking at the court, they would pin the blame for the economic war that had precipitated the Rice War on Daimyo Yasuki Miwako, resulting in her being executed for treason. Unfortunately, the woes of the Crane clan were far from over. Having witnessed the relative success of Hida Tsuneko and with his own people starving, Akodo Masahisa decided to try his hand at pillaging Crane lands. Luckily, Kenburo and the Imperial legions were still active and in the field, and so they pivoted to face the new threat. Once again, fortunately, fighting proved unnecessary. The Lion had a brief period of smashing and plundering, but then when the Imperial legions confronted them, Kenburo arranged a personal meeting with Masahisa and made him an offer. His adopted brother could take his army back to Lion Lands with all the food they'd stolen so far, or they could fight it out here and Kenburo would destroy them. Masahisa knew Kenburo better than most and knew that the Emerald Champion was not one to make idle threats, so he wisely accepted the offer. But of course, even that was not the end of Doji Morito's problems, as a tainted Shadowland fleet began raiding the southern coast of the empire, lands that had recently been ravaged by the Crab Clan in the Rice War. The Crane Champion's lone consolation, if you could call it that, was the knowledge that soon he wasn't the only one being attacked, as Asahime and her secret rebel army chose that moment to rise up and began seizing villages, some in the south but mostly along the northern provinces of the empire. Calling themselves the People's Legion, the rebels seized multiple villages and even cities, slaughtering the samurai garrisoning them. Meanwhile, seeing what had happened to the Crane clan, Bayushi Hideyari, champion of the Scorpion clan, decided that the smart move would be to get on the good side of both the Lion and Crab clans, sending them what food he could spare and backing them politically in the imperial court. And it worked. Unfortunately, his cousin, Jade Champion Yogo Yoshi, was less successful in his efforts. Not far from Beiden Pass, where the borders of the Scorpion and Crane clans meet, is a lake. It had originally been known as the Lake of Shining Glass, but at some unknown date in the early history of the Empire, there had been a savage conflict known as the Battle of the Hour of the Wolf. A combined Scorpion-Crane army had fought and bested an army of the Lion clan on its shores, but so many men on both sides had died that the waters of the lake had run red, and so it was renamed Akamizu Umi, Red Lake. In 664, a Mahotsukai cult had formed around the shores of the lake, led by a mysterious figure known only as Dear Uncle. The peasants living near Aka-Umi Mizo were fanatically loyal to him because he used his Maho blood magic to strengthen their crops and ensure that they had full bellies. And so any Scorpion magistrate sent to investigate rumors of evil magic in the area tended to disappear. In the end, it was the elemental masters of the Phoenix clan who exposed and destroyed Dear Uncle's cult, and they used that to completely discredit Yoshi. As Jade Champion, he presumed to be the Empire's foremost expert on magic, and yet he couldn't uncover and deal with a Maho cult in his own clan's backyard? Thoroughly humiliated, Yogo Yoshi retired to a monastery, and the office of Jade Champion was left defunct for centuries. As ever, Hantei XX remained unconcerned with the suffering of his people. At that year's winter court, hosted at Shiro Mirumoto, his only concern was being so fascinated by the continued secluded meditation of Dragon Champion Togashi Toshimasa that he ordered a replica of the Dragon Champion's quarters built in the Imperial Palace so that he might meditate in the same surroundings as Toshimasa. Meanwhile, the Dragon Clan had completely exhausted its own food supplies, and once again, peasants and low-rank samurai alike began dying of starvation in droves. The old year passed, and the new year of 665 began. In some ways, things got worse, but in others, things actually started to improve. Tetsuken, champion of the Mantis clan, approached Doji Morito, suggesting that he could deal with the Shadowland fleet that was ravaging the southern coast. His price was the hand of Morito's daughter Sanayo in marriage. Before, such an offer would have been ludicrous. Tetsuken had only recently assumed leadership of the Mantis clan. He'd been the youngest son of the previous incumbent Ieyasu the Leper. But when his father and eldest brother and heir presumptive had died, Tetsuken had made the smart move of approaching Hantei XX with many gifts, and thus he was confirmed by the emperor as the new leader. What's more, the Mantis were not only a minor clan, they were, in the eyes of many, a fairly disreputable clan. The odds of marrying the daughter of the Crane clan champion was low. But these were not ordinary times, and Morito, with gritted teeth it must be imagined, accepted the offer. After pursuing the enemy fleet for weeks, Tetsuken realized that they were sailing north towards Otosan Uchi, the capital. His Mantis fleet managed to intercept them before they reached Golden Sun Bay, and Tetsuken heroically sailed his flagship, the Dancing Orochi, into the midst of the enemy fleet. They proceeded to turn their weapons on the Dancing Orochi, killing everyone on board. But Tetsuken's heroic sacrifice had given the Mantis fleet enough time to surround the Shadowlands fleet and destroy it utterly. In keeping with the custom of the Mantis clan, the Dancing Orochi was set ablaze along with all of its honored dead. It's never been said what Doji Sanayo thought of Tetsuken, but the fact that she shaved her head and entered a monastery when she heard of his death certainly is suggestive. As for the second piece of good news, remember how earlier the Phoenix clan seemed to be doing well enough that it was willing to take on the burden of the Dragon clan refugees? Well, it turns out that this was down to the influence of Isawa Michikata, the elemental master of Earth, who, after lengthy research, had begun employing spells to rejuvenate the soil of the Phoenix clan lands. Naturally, when this became public knowledge, imperial emissaries were sent asking for Michikata's aid in healing the empire. And this he was prepared to do, just not for free. As it turned out, Michikata had many unmarried daughters. In exchange for healing the soil of the empire and rejuvenating the fields, his price would be that they should all be married to men of high connection and prestige. This was agreed to, and it was the emperor's sister, Otomo Madoko, who arranged the marriages, though it's never mentioned who were the lucky high-prestige grooms. Either way, Michikata and his acolytes set to work across the empire, and at last the land began to heal. But there was still the People's Legion to deal with. By now, they effectively controlled all of the southern provinces of the Dragon Clan, and had successfully repulsed several efforts by the Lion Clan to dislodge them. What's worse, Asahime, the Legion's leader, had gained a powerful new ally. The monk Rojin, formerly Akodo Akihisa, once champion of the Lion Clan. He had joined the Legion, believing that helping the peasants in their rebellion might help make up for his past crimes. By now, the People's Legion had grown so large and concentrated that Asahime knew that the sparse, mountainous lands of the Dragon Clan could no longer support them. After some consultation with her advisors, it was decided that the Legion would move westward, into the lands that had once belonged to the Kirin clan but had been stewarded by the Lion since the reign of Emperor Genji. Since these lands were sparsely populated and then only by peasant farmers, it was easy for the People's Legion to seize control of the area, establishing a makeshift capital at the fortified village of Bikami. Still, for all their success, the People's Legion could not stand against the Empire alone. And so, on the advice of Rojin, Asahime began making covert diplomatic overtures. Gifts of food were sent to the Scorpion and Dragon clans, disincentivizing them from giving aid to the Lion, who still persisted in trying to wipe the Legion out. Asahime also managed to strike up a tenuous alliance with the Yobanjin, the fierce independent tribes that lived beyond the northern border. However, when she sent similar overtures to the Badger clan, living in their isolated mountainous corner of the empire, clan champion Ichiro Yoshinobu not only refused, but he mustered his entire clan's fighting force to confront the Legion. The Badger clan actually lost the battle that followed, but suffered only light casualties, and, ever pragmatic, resorted to guerrilla warfare once it was clear they couldn't defeat the People's Legion in open battle. Thus, Yoshinobu and his clan would remain a thorn in Asahime's side for the remainder of the rebellion. That said, the Legion still enjoyed great success in the field. Twice the Lion Clan armies attempted to take Bikami, and twice they were repulsed. The first attack, led by Akodo Masaumi, heir to the Lion Clan championship, ended so miserably that he committed seppuku out of shame. His father, Masahisa, enraged by his son's death, led the second attack. This time the People's Legion suffered heavy losses, but then Asahime, who had trained in martial arts and the ways of war, managed to kill Masahisa in single combat. The first and possibly only time in history that a clan champion of samurai rank died at the hands of a peasant. Seeing this, the Lion Clan lost heart, the People's Legion rallied, and the rebels slaughtered the enemy to a man. The Lion Clan would spend the next 2 years licking their wounds and mustering their strength. Since Akodo Masahisa's closest kinsman was far too young to lead, a warrior maiden named Matsu Ikuko became acting Lion Clan champion. In spite of this, however, things were beginning to turn the Empire's way. In the following year of 666, thanks to the efforts of Isawa Michikata and his acolytes, Rokugan enjoyed its first successful harvest in 6 years. The year after that, 667, the People's Legion decided that it was time to take the offensive and laid siege to the City of Honor's Sacrifice. The campaign proved a disaster for Asahime's followers. For all their success in the field, the People's Legion lacked the military discipline of the samurai caste. The besiegers' camps were untidy and squalid, and soon enough, disease began stalking the People's Legion. Those who didn't die of illness were slaughtered by a relieving lion army. Thus, the People's Legion suffered its first major defeat. The Legion had lost so many, in fact, that Asahime was forced to beg for reinforcements from the Yobanjin tribes. What's more, as Rokugan enjoyed its second successful harvest, the bribes of food and supplies that had been used by the Legion to keep clans like the Dragon and Scorpion neutral were starting to lose their effect. The tide was slowly but surely turning against Asahime and her followers. The following year of 668 saw a third consecutive good harvest. At last, the Emerald Empire was deemed to be fully recovered, and the Great Famine was declared officially over. Now that their peasants were no longer starving, the clans began urging Hantei XX to take more decisive action against the rebels. And so, at his behest, the Lion Clan made a third attack upon Bikami, this time commanded by Matsu Ikuko, leading the fabled Lion's Pride and carrying Shori, the ancestral blade of the Lion Clan. This time the battle was close, as the Lion Clan stormed Bikami's defenses and Ikuko actually managed to corner Asahime and her close followers, including a monk whom she recognized as having once been Akodo Akihisa, clan champion of the Lion. But though Rojin was old and retired, it seemed that he still retained his battle skill. And though the duel was close, Rojin ultimately triumphed, severing Ikuko's right leg at the knee. The People's Legion rallied, and once again the Lion army was forced to retreat in ignominious defeat. Ikuko managed to survive the final battle, but that year at Winter Court she presented Shori to the Emperor and asked to commit seppuku for her failure. Hantei XX granted her request, and once that was done, he insisted that his Emerald champion, Akodo Kenburo, take up Shori and leadership of the Lion Clan. Thus it was that the man who had begun his career as a lowly Ronin now came to hold two of the most prestigious offices in the Emerald Empire: Emerald Champion and Lion Clan Champion, right hand of the Emperor. Never before had a man risen so high so quickly. And so the calendar turned once more. It was the year 669, and the People's Legion found themselves staring at their doom. It was not just the Lion Clan army this time. This time, there was also the Imperial Legions, as well as military units contributed from every clan, great and small, commanded by the Emerald Champion and the Emperor himself in person. What followed was less a battle than a slaughter. The samurai of the combined armies hunted down and slew every peasant rebel they could get their hands on. Only a few slipped through the net, including Rojin and Asahime. When Kenburo learned of the stout resistance the Badger clan had shown the rebels, he gifted Ichiro Yoshinobu with the Ogre's Knife, the sword that he had carried as a Ronin, a mark of high esteem. As for Asahime, her escape from imperial justice proved short-lived. She managed to hole up with a few followers inside a small, isolated fortress in the Dragon Mountains, but now she was not only a beaten rebel, but the Emperor had placed on her head a bounty of 10,000 koku, an offer far too tempting to pass up. Her own followers betrayed her location to Imperial forces, and one night, a squad of Scorpion Clan shinobi planted charges of explosive gaijin pepper throughout Asahime's bolt hole. The charges were then detonated, and the castle was consumed in a fiery explosion. So perished the founder of the People's Legion. Not only had the peasant rebellion been crushed, but it would be subsequently erased from official imperial history. Rojin managed to avoid detection for another 2 years, but then, in 671, Akoto Kenburo of all people discovered him hiding in a lion shrine. If Rojin had any hopes that he might expect clemency from the man that he had personally raised to samurai rank, he was sorely mistaken. Upon recognizing the traitor, an enraged Kenburo proceeded to beat the old monk to death with his bare hands. That same year, Mirumoto Umeka, heartbroken after the suicide of her beloved Shiba Moriaki, chose to retire as Mirumoto Daimyo, passing the office to her eldest legitimate son. And so, with that, the travails of the Great Famine were finally over. It was a time of chaos and bloodshed that Rokugan would not see again until the Clan War in the 12th century. He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available in ebook, paperback, and audio form. Links in the description.